The colossal spacecraft of the Galactic Confederation descended from the clouds, casting an immense shadow over Beijing's skyline. Its metallic surface gleamed in the sunlight, creating dazzling patterns across the city below. Citizens stopped in their tracks, pointing skyward at the undeniable proof that humanity was no longer alone in the universe. Ambassador Song Kim stood at attention on the designated landing pad, his formal diplomatic uniform perfectly pressed despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Beside him, Earth's highest-ranking officials maintained their composure, though their rapid heartbeats betrayed their anxiety. This was humanity's first official contact with an advanced alien civilization, and everything about the moment felt heavy with significance. The spacecraft's landing ramp extended with mechanical precision. 6 alien figures emerged, walking with confident strides. The Confederation representatives stood nearly 9 feet tall, their bodies covered in natural armor plates that resembled burnished bronze. Their 4 eyes, 2 large primary ones and 2 smaller secondary ones, scanned the human delegation with clinical detachment. "Welcome to Earth," Ambassador Kim said, bowing slightly. "We are honored by your presence." The lead alien, Teruk, inclined his massive head. When he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The Galactic Confederation appreciates your hospitality. We have observed your planet for some time." Teruk's gaze swept across the human delegation, his expression unreadable. "Your technological achievements are adequate. Your space travel primitive but functional. Your information systems rudimentary but effective." He paused. "However, your physical capabilities are frankly disappointing." A murmur rippled through the human delegation. Ambassador Kim maintained his diplomatic smile, though it grew strained. "We look forward to learning from the Confederation. Perhaps you might be surprised by what humans can accomplish despite our physical limitations." Teruk made a sound that might have been laughter. "Perhaps." The welcoming ceremony continued with speeches and formal exchanges of symbolic gifts. The aliens towered over their human hosts, making even the tallest basketball players in the delegation appear small and fragile by comparison. Their movements were efficient and powerful, their reflexes visibly superior to human capabilities. That afternoon, the cultural exchange program began in the Great Hall of the People. Various human talents were displayed: music, art, dance, and finally, martial arts. Master Handley of the Shaolin Temple had been selected to represent Earth's fighting traditions. At 62, his lean frame disguised decades of disciplined training and wisdom. Master Li stepped onto the demonstration floor wearing simple black cotton pants and a sleeveless shirt. He bowed to the audience, then began his demonstration. His movements started slowly, controlled breathing combined with precise positioning. As he continued, his speed increased. His body flowed like water, transitions between forms appearing effortless. He demonstrated strikes and blocks with such speed that many human observers could barely follow his movements. He leaped high into the air, spinning and landing with perfect balance. His final sequence involved breaking several concrete blocks with pinpoint strikes. When Master Li finished, he bowed again and stepped back, hands clasped before him. The human audience erupted in applause. The aliens remained silent. Then, one by one, they began to make rough barking sounds. It took the human delegation several uncomfortable moments to realize the aliens were laughing. Teruk rose from his seat, his massive frame dominating the space. "These are your combat techniques." His voice boomed through the hall. "These elaborate dances might be aesthetically pleasing, but they would not survive a single blow from even our youngest warriors." Another alien, with darker armor plates, added, "Your species lacks natural defenses. No claws, no armor, minimal strength. These theatrical movements cannot compensate for biological inadequacy." Master Li's expression remained perfectly calm, though several other martial arts masters in the audience showed visible anger. Ambassador Kim stepped forward. Master Li represents thousands of years of human martial arts tradition. These disciplines were developed to allow humans to defend themselves against stronger opponents, both animals and other humans. They emphasize technique and skill over raw strength. An admirable attempt to overcome your limitations, Terra conceded, but ultimately futile against superior biology. Our youngest cadets could demonstrate this if you wished. Master Li finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. Respectfully, physical capability is only one aspect of combat. Mind, spirit, and technique are equally important. Tarek's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a comforting philosophy for the physically weak. He turned to Ambassador Kim. We appreciate your cultural demonstrations. Perhaps tomorrow we might show you some of our combat traditions. That night, Earth's officials gathered in an emergency session. Military leaders, diplomats, and scientists debated how to improve humanity's standing with the Confederation. Their technology is centuries beyond ours, Defense Minister Park said grimly. If they decide we're not worth their time, or worse, that we're only good for colonization, we have no effective defense. They seem fixated on physical prowess, noted Dr. Jin, the lead xenobiologist. Their society appears highly stratified based on combat ability. It's reminiscent of certain warrior cultures from Earth's history. Ambassador Kim rubbed his temples. We need to find common ground, something they can respect. The door opened, and a Confederation liaison entered. The alien handed Ambassador Kim a data tablet. The High Command has made a decision regarding Earth's potential status within the Confederation. The room fell silent as Kim read the tablet. His face paled slightly. They're organizing a combat tournament, he announced. Representatives from Earth will compete against fighters from Confederation worlds. Our performance will determine whether we're offered full membership, protectorate status, or, he didn't finish the sentence, or resource world status, the alien liaison completed flatly. The tournament begins in 30 days. Each participating planet may send up to 3 representatives. After the liaison departed, chaos erupted in the meeting room. This is absurd. They're setting us up to fail. General Wu slammed his fist on the table. We could decline participation, suggested another diplomat, and appear even weaker. Minister Park shook his head. Impossible. In the corner of the room, Master Li had been sitting quietly, observing. Now he rose to his feet. I will represent Earth, he said simply. All eyes turned to him. Master Li, Ambassador Kim said gently, you saw these aliens. They're twice our size with natural armor. Their reflexes are clearly superior. Yes, Li nodded. I observed them carefully. They rely on strength and natural advantages. This makes them predictable. General Wu scoffed. Predictable or not, they could break you in half. Perhaps, Master Li acknowledged with a slight smile. But they would have to catch me first. And greater strength often leads to greater arrogance. He bowed to the assembled officials. I have spent 60 years studying how to overcome superior force. Allow me this opportunity to put my training to use when it matters most. Ambassador Kim studied the old master's serene face. Despite the seemingly impossible odds, he sensed something in the man's quiet confidence. The tournament allows 3 representatives, Kim said slowly. We'll conduct trials to select the most suitable candidates. If Master Li qualifies, he can participate. Master Li bowed again. I will be ready. As he left the meeting, Li felt the weight of humanity's future settling on his shoulders. The aliens had laughed at humanity's martial traditions, traditions that had been refined over thousands of years of human conflict. Soon, they would learn that human ingenuity, discipline, and adaptability were forces not to be underestimated. In his hotel room, Master Li began his evening meditation and training routine. Tomorrow, he would start studying recordings of the alien physiology in detail. Every species had weaknesses. It was simply a matter of finding them. The United Nations Security Council had convened an emergency session in New York. Representatives from every major nation sat around the large circular table, their faces grim. Behind them, advisors whispered urgently to one another. The stakes could not be higher. Earth's future as a free planet hung in the balance. Ambassador Kim stood at the podium, explaining the Galactic Confederation's tournament rules. Each species must provide between 1 and 3 representatives. The competition will test combat skills across multiple environments and gravity conditions. Performance in this tournament will determine Earth's status in the interstellar community. Screens around the chamber displayed images of the alien competitors, massive beings with natural armor, enhanced reflexes, and strength far beyond human capacity. Several military leaders shook their heads in dismay. Our analysts believe we have 3 options, continued Kim. First, we could send military special forces operators, our physically strongest fighters. Second, we could offer to contribute technologically rather than martially. Or third, we could reject the terms entirely and hope for diplomatic alternatives. General Park, a decorated veteran with a stern face and graying hair, leaned forward. The third option is suicide. Rejection would be seen as weakness. As for technology, they're centuries ahead of us. That leaves us with option 1. We select our best Special Forces soldiers and train them intensively for the next 30 days. With respect, came a quiet voice from the observer section. I believe there is a 4th option. All heads turned toward Master Hanley. Though he had been invited as a cultural advisor, he had said almost nothing since the meeting began. The floor recognizes Master Lee, said the Secretary General. Lee stood, his simple black clothing a stark contrast to the formal attire and military uniforms around him. Though past 60, he moved with the fluid grace of someone far younger. I will represent Earth, he declared, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the chamber. Murmurs and objections immediately filled the room. General Park rose to his feet, face flushing. This is madness, he objected, pointing to the screens showing the alien warriors. Master Lee, with all due respect to your skills and traditions, these aliens have twice our strength and natural armor. They were engineered for combat. Several other military leaders voiced similar concerns. The room grew louder until the Secretary General called for order. Master Lee waited for silence before speaking again. His face remained serene, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The purpose of Shaolin is not to overpower, but to understand, he said simply. For 5,000 years, humans have developed martial arts precisely because we are not the strongest creatures. We learn to overcome superior force through technique, awareness, and turning an opponent's strength against them. Theory is fine for demonstrations, countered a Russian general, but this is reality. These aliens will crush any human in direct combat. Master Lee nodded. Perhaps, but the tournament rules specify non-lethal combat across varying terrains and gravity conditions. This requires adaptability, humanity's greatest strength. Ambassador Kim looked thoughtful. Master Lee may have a point. The aliens value combat prowess, but they shown particular disdain for our martial arts traditions. There would be a certain poetic justice if those same traditions proved effective. The debate continued for hours. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Earth would send 3 representatives, Master Lee, a champion mixed martial artist named Jin, and a special forces commander named Captain Seo. 2 days later, all 3 began intensive training at a secure facility outside Seoul, while Captain Seo and Jin focused on strength conditioning and studying alien physiology. Master Lee approached training differently. In his private quarters, Lee sat cross-legged on the floor before a large holographic display. He watched footage of various Confederation species in combat, his eyes alert and focused. Each time, he would mimic their movements, feeling how their biology dictated their fighting style. The door slid open, and an assistant announced, "Master Lee, the data you requested on gravity variations." Lee nodded thanks and returned to his study. The hologram showed a hulking Drokai warrior demonstrating combat techniques. Lee watched intently, noting how the alien relied on overwhelming force, but shifted its weight in predictable patterns before striking. Another display showed Vylorian fighters who possessed lightning reflexes but revealed poor balance when forced to change direction suddenly. A third projection depicted the tank-like Tekaru species, nearly impervious to impact but limited in joint mobility. Fascinating, Lee murmured. He rose and began moving through forms that would exploit these weaknesses, adapting ancient Shaolin techniques to counter specific alien physiologies. Later that afternoon, Lee moved to the outdoor training area. Unlike the high-tech facilities where Captain Seo and Jin trained with advanced equipment, Lee had requested a simple space with natural elements: rocks, water, sand, and wooden posts driven into the ground. He began with breathing exercises, then progressed to forms that looked deceptively simple. His movements were economical, nothing wasted. As his practice intensified, he incorporated the wooden posts, striking them with precision, while always maintaining perfect balance. "Your training looks inefficient," came a deep voice from the entrance. Lee turned to see Terok, the Confederation's lead representative, watching him. The alien's massive frame filled the doorway, his four eyes studying Lee with what appeared to be curiosity. Lee bowed respectfully. "Honored representative, what brings you to our training facility?" Terok stepped inside, his heavy footfalls leaving impressions in the sand. "Curiosity. Our analysts predicted your military would select your physically superior specimens. Yet here you are, advanced in years by human standards, with no apparent technological enhancements." Lee continued his exercises as they spoke, different approaches to the same challenge. Terok watched Lee move between the wooden posts, striking them with precision. "Our warriors gain strength through genetic enhancement and exoskeletal augmentation. From childhood, they are modified for combat optimization." Lee nodded, completing a complex sequence before responding. "Different traditions. We modify our techniques, not our bodies." The alien made a sound that might have been skepticism. "Your techniques cannot overcome biological limitations. Physics does not allow it." Lee paused, turning fully toward Terok. "Perhaps. And yet," he replied with quiet confidence, "you have never faced an opponent who turns your strength against you." Terok's secondary eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of interest. Lee had learned. "Explain." "In Shaolin tradition, we study the ways of water," Lee said. "Water does not resist force. It flows around it. When a strong man pushes against water, he finds nothing to push against. When he strikes it, his force dissipates. Yet water, given time, can carve through mountains." Terok considered this. An interesting philosophy. However, in the arena, philosophies collide with reality. "Indeed they do," Lee agreed with a slight smile. "Reality is what I prepare for." To demonstrate, Lee moved to a large stone at the edge of the training area. He placed his hand against it and closed his eyes in concentration. Then, with a sudden sharp movement, his palm struck the stone. A crack appeared, then widened until the boulder split neatly in two. Terok's head tilted, a gesture of surprise. Impressive for a human, though our junior cadets can pulverize such stones. "I did not wish to pulverize it," Lee explained. "I wished to split it precisely along its natural fault line. Fighting is not always about force. Sometimes it is about finding the perfect point of leverage." For the first time, Terok seemed genuinely thoughtful. "You are unlike the other humans selected for the tournament. They train with machines and simulations. You train with antiquated methods." Lee bowed slightly. "Old does not always mean obsolete," respected Terok. "Sometimes the oldest paths contain forgotten wisdom." After Terok departed, Lee returned to his training with renewed focus. The conversation had confirmed what he had suspected. The Confederation warriors, for all their physical superiority, had a fundamental blind spot. They understood force, but not the redirection of force. They recognized strength, but not the subtle power of yielding. That evening, as Captain Seo and Jin discussed strategy over dinner, Lee sat quietly, listening. Their approaches were valid. Seo's military precision, and Jin's raw fighting instinct would serve Earth well. But Li knew that humanity's best hope lay in showing the Confederation something they had never seen before, a fighter who did not try to match their strength, but who made their strength irrelevant. Later, in the darkness of his quarters, Li performed one final meditation. Tomorrow would bring more training, more preparation. The tournament loomed just weeks away. Earth's fate might well rest on his aging shoulders, and on 5,000 years of human martial wisdom that aliens had dismissed as mere elaborate dances. Li smiled in the darkness. Sometimes, the greatest advantage was being underestimated. The massive tournament arena hung in Earth's orbit like a gleaming silver jewel. Built by the Confederation in just 2 weeks, it was a marvel of alien engineering, a perfect sphere with transparent sections that offered breathtaking views of Earth below. Inside, the arena could transform its environment completely, simulating different gravity conditions, terrains, and atmospheres. Master Li stood in the preparation chamber with Captain Sio and Jin. Unlike his companions who wore specialized combat suits, Li had chosen simple black training clothes. His only concession to technology was a small breathing apparatus in case of atmospheric changes. "First rounds are about to begin," announced the human liaison officer. "Captain Sio, you'll fight in the desert environment against a Takaru warrior. Jin, you're in the aquatic arena against a Vylorian. Master Li, you're assigned to standard gravity against a Drokai opponent." Captain Sio clasped Li's shoulder. "Remember what we discussed. The Drokai have poor peripheral vision despite their 4 eyes. Their back armor plates have small gaps." Li nodded calmly. "I will remember." An announcement echoed through the chamber in multiple languages. "Earth Representative Master Li, please proceed to Arena 3. Li walked through the long corridor that led to the fighting area. On either side, observation windows revealed thousands of alien spectators from dozens of species. Many were pointing at him, their expressions unreadable to human eyes, but their body language suggesting amusement or dismissal. Arena 3 was a simple circular platform 50 meters across, surrounded by force fields to protect spectators. As Li stepped onto the platform, the audience noise diminished to curious murmurs. From the opposite entrance emerged Li's opponent, a Drokai warrior named Korov. The alien stood nearly 10 feet tall, his bronze-colored armor plates gleaming under the arena lights. His massive arms ended in retractable claws, currently extended in pre-combat display. A translator device conveyed his words to Li. "Human," Korov rumbled, "I will attempt to damage you minimally. Your fragile body type is unfamiliar to me." Li bowed respectfully. "Thank you for your consideration. I will also exercise caution." This exchange prompted laughter from the alien spectators. Even the tournament officials seemed amused as he announced the rules. Combat continues until submission, incapacitation, or the judge's decision. Lethal force is forbidden. Begin at the signal. A tone sounded, and Korov immediately charged forward with devastating force. His speed was shocking for a creature of his size, closing the distance to Li in seconds. His clawed hand swept toward Li in what would surely be a disabling blow if it connected. But it didn't connect. At the last possible moment, Li seemed to simply not be where Korov expected. The human had shifted position with such fluid grace that many observers couldn't track the movement. Li now stood slightly to Korov's right, his expression calm. Korov roared in surprise and pivoted, launching another powerful attack. Again, Li moved just enough to avoid the blow, his body flowing like water around the alien strikes. After the third missed attack, Li finally countered, not with a block or a punch, but by lightly touching specific points on Korov's arm and shoulder as the alien's momentum carried him forward. Korov stumbled, his right arm suddenly hanging limp at his side. "What trickery is this?" the alien demanded, his translator conveying confusion and anger. Li resumed his ready position. "No trickery, just knowledge." Korov attacked again, now more cautiously. Li continued his strategy of minimal movement and precise counters, striking nerve clusters and pressure points that human martial artists had mapped on their own bodies for thousands of years. These points existed in different locations on Drokai physiology, but Lee had studied the alien anatomical data thoroughly. After 5 minutes of combat, Korev was struggling to move, multiple limbs temporarily disabled by Lee's precise strikes. The crowd had fallen into stunned silence. With one final, perfect movement, Lee swept the alien's legs and sent the massive Drokai crashing to the platform. Korev tried to rise but found his body unresponsive. I submit, the alien finally growled. The arena erupted in confused chatter. The officials seemed momentarily at a loss before declaring, "The winner is Earth Representative Lee." As Lee bowed to his opponent and helped the recovering Drokai to his feet, the spectator screens displayed the results from the other arenas. Captain Seo had lost his match against the Takaru, while Jin had managed to force a draw against his Vylorian opponent. Back in the preparation chamber, medical staff examined Lee for injuries. "How did you do that?" Jin asked, his own body showing bruises from his difficult match. "It looked like you barely touched him." "Pressure points," Lee explained simply. "All bodies, even alien ones, have networks for transmitting commands from brain to limb. Interrupt that network temporarily, and strength becomes irrelevant." Before they could discuss further, the liaison officer returned. "Master Lee, you've been rescheduled for your next match in 2 hours. The Confederation High Command has expressed interest in your fighting style." Indeed, throughout the Confederation viewing areas, Lee's victory was the only topic of discussion. In his private viewing chamber, Grand Champion Verix, an elite warrior from the mysterious Nexari species, studied recordings of Lee's match with intense focus. His angular face and gleaming black exoskeleton reflected the holographic projections as he watched the fight sequence for the 5th time. "Replay the moment of first contact," Verix instructed his advisors. The projection zoomed in on Lee's fingers as they precisely struck Korev's nerve clusters. "This human does not fight like the others," Verix observed, his deep voice thoughtful. "The other human representatives attempt to match strength with strength, to adapt our techniques. But this one..." He paused, studying Lee's movements. "He fights as though gravity and strength are suggestions, not laws." His chief advisor, a battle-scarred Vylorian, nodded. "His technique is unlike anything in our combat database. He seems to use the opponent's force against them." "Precisely," said Verix. "Schedule my next 3 days to observe all his matches. There is something here we must understand." Over the next 16 hours, Lee fought and defeated 3 more opponents: a Vylorian whose lightning reflexes couldn't compensate for poor balance, a Tekaru whose incredible durability proved useless when Lee targeted its limited joint mobility, and a Celavarn whose 6 limbs became a liability when Lee redirected its attacks. After each victory, Lee bowed respectfully to his opponent and offered assistance if they were struggling to recover. His calm demeanor never changed, whether facing ridicule before matches or astonishment after his victories. News of the unusual human fighter spread throughout the tournament. Spectators who had come to watch their own species champions began requesting seats for Lee's matches. Betting pools, which had placed Lee's survival chances at near zero initially, now showed rapidly improving odds. After his 5th victory, against a particularly fearsome Drokai elite warrior, Lee was resting in the meditation area provided for competitors. Unlike the lavish recovery rooms of the Confederation champions, Earth's representatives had been assigned minimal facilities. Lee didn't mind. He sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The door slid open. Lee opened his eyes to find 3 alien competitors watching him with what appeared to be curiosity rather than the usual contempt. "Earth fighter," said one, a Vylorian whose name Lee recalled was Telax. "This one was defeated by you yesterday. This one seeks understanding." Lee gestured for them to enter. "How may I assist you?" The Vylorian moved closer, mimicking Lee's cross-legged position with some difficulty. "Your technique. It is not strength. It is not speed. yet it is effective. How? Lee considered how to explain concepts that had taken him decades to master. In our traditions, we believe that force can be redirected rather than opposed, like water flowing around a rock rather than trying to move it. The third alien, a species Lee hadn't encountered yet, tilted its elongated head. But water does not defeat rock. Given enough time, water shapes rock, carves canyons, reduces mountains to sand. Lee replied, "Patience and persistence overcome raw power." The aliens exchanged looks that Lee couldn't interpret. "Would you demonstrate?" asked Tlax hesitantly. Lee nodded and rose to his feet. "Stand here," he instructed Tlax. "Try to strike me. Slowly, please." The Vilorian threw a restrained punch. Lee gently redirected the alien's arm, using minimal contact to completely change the attack's direction. "You see, I use your momentum, not my strength." For the next hour, Lee demonstrated basic principles to the increasingly fascinated aliens. Word spread quickly. By the time Lee was called for his next match, 6 more competitors had joined the impromptu class. As Lee walked through the corridor toward his 6th match, he noticed a distinct change in the atmosphere. The derision was gone from the spectators' eyes. Now they watched him with something new, respect, and perhaps a touch of fear. Master Lee sat in the small recovery chamber, applying a cooling pack to his shoulder. His last match against a Selavarn warrior had been challenging. The 6-limbed alien had nearly caught him with a surprise attack from an unexpected angle. Lee had prevailed, but not without cost. His body, though exceptionally conditioned for a human his age, was feeling the strain of 7 consecutive matches against physically superior opponents. The door slid open, revealing Sorek, the Vilorian fighter Lee had defeated 2 days earlier. The tall, slender alien skin had a bluish tint, and the natural ridge armor along its forearms still bore marks from their encounter. "Earth fighter," Sorek said, bowing in what appeared to be an attempt to mimic human respect gestures. "This one requests permission to enter." Lee nodded, setting aside the cooling pack. "Of course. How may I help you?" Sorek entered hesitantly, folding his long limbs to sit across from Lee. The alien studied him with large amber eyes that blinked sideways rather than up and down. "Your movements conserve energy while maximizing impact," noted Sorek. "Our species has always relied on overwhelming force." After our match, this one reviewed the recording multiple times. "You struck me 17 times, but I felt only 3 impacts." Lee smiled. "The most effective strikes are those the opponent doesn't recognize until their effects become apparent." "You targeted neural pathway junctions. How did you know their locations on Vilorian anatomy?" Sorek asked. "I studied the biological data provided by your medical teams," Lee explained. "All bodies, regardless of origin, have systems for transmitting signals between brain and limbs. Find these pathways, and you can temporarily disrupt them." Sorek leaned forward with obvious interest. "Could you demonstrate again, without combat intention?" Lee agreed, and soon they were standing in the center of the room. Lee guided Sorek through simple movements, showing how minimal force applied precisely could affect the entire body. The alien was a quick study, mimicking Lee's motions with growing accuracy. Word spread quickly. The next day, when Lee arrived at his training area, 5 different alien competitors waited outside. They represented diverse species: a hulking Drokai, 2 Vilorians including Sorek, a 4-armed Takaru, and a serpentine being Lee hadn't encountered in combat. "Master Lee," Sorek said, "these fighters request instruction in your techniques." Lee considered the request. These were representatives of species that had initially mocked human martial arts. Now they stood before him as students. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the opportunity to build understanding. "I would be honored," Lee said, bowing to the group. Over the next 2 hours, Lee demonstrated basic forms to the small group of aliens. Each species had different physical capabilities and limitations, requiring Lee to adapt his teachings accordingly. The Drokai struggled with fluid movements but excelled at rooting techniques. The Vylorians quickly grasped the concept of redirecting force, but found it difficult to moderate their natural speed. "Why did humans develop these techniques?" asked the Tekaru, whose name was Morn. "Your species has no natural weapons like our arm spikes or the Drokai claws." Lee demonstrated this simple blocking technique as he answered. "Martial arts developed because humans were not the strongest creatures on Earth. We learned to survive against predators through observation and adaptation. For thousands of years, we studied animals, the power of tigers, the patience of cranes, the flexibility of snakes, and incorporated their movements into our fighting styles." "You modeled combat on animals weaker than yourselves?" the Drokai asked incredulously. "We modeled combat on all animals," Lee corrected. "We learned from both predators and prey. The prey animals often had the most valuable lessons, how to survive despite disadvantages." The aliens exchanged glances that suggested this concept challenged their fundamental understanding of combat evolution. "In Shaolin tradition," Lee continued, "we believe that true strength comes from balance between opposing forces, hard and soft, yielding and advancing, force and redirection." As the impromptu class continued, more aliens gathered to watch from the corridor. Tournament officials, initially concerned about the gathering, soon recognized the educational nature of the session and allowed it to proceed. Meanwhile, throughout the Confederation fleet orbiting Earth, Lee's unexpected success had become the primary topic of discussion. Viewing stations that had previously focused on traditional champions now broadcast Lee's matches exclusively. Combat analysis programs struggled to predict his movements, as they defied conventional patterns and sometimes appeared to violate physical expectations. In the elite Confederation Council chambers, military strategists debated the implications of human fighting techniques. What had begun as a simple tournament to determine Earth's status had evolved into something far more significant, a revaluation of Confederation combat doctrine itself. Lee's next match drew record viewership across the fleet. He faced a Nexari warrior, a species known for their exceptional speed and calculated fighting style. The match lasted nearly 15 minutes, longer than any of Lee's previous encounters. The Nexari adapted quickly to Lee's techniques, forcing him to continuously innovate. In the end, Lee prevailed by using the arena's variable gravity field to his advantage, demonstrating perfect balance while his opponent struggled to adjust. When Lee returned to the Earth representatives' quarters that evening, he found Captain Seo and Jin waiting for him. Both had been eliminated from the tournament, but remained as support staff. "Master Lee," Captain Seo said urgently, "you've become something of a celebrity. The Confederation High Command has requested your presence at a special session tomorrow." "Is this usual protocol?" Lee asked. Jin shook his head. "Not according to our liaisons. Something about your fighting style has caught their attention at the highest levels." The next morning, Lee was escorted to a massive command vessel hanging in orbit above the tournament arena. The interior was designed for beings much larger than humans, making Lee feel like a child in an adult world. Guards led him to an imposing chamber where 7 aliens sat in a semicircle on raised platforms. At the center sat Grand Champion Varix, his black exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber lights. Unlike most Nexari, whose bodies resembled humanoid insects, Varix had extensive battle modifications, reinforced limbs, and what appeared to be integrated weapon systems currently in passive mode. "Earth Representative Lee," Varix said, his translator converting his clicks and vibrations to human language. "Your performance has been unexpected." Lee bowed respectfully. "Thank you for granting me this audience. Our analysts cannot explain your success," continued Varix. "Your biological parameters indicate you should not prevail against our warriors. Yet you have defeated 7 champions from 7 species. Sometimes understanding exceeds physical capability," Lee replied simply. Varix studied him with compound eyes that reflected Lee's image back at him. "Your species was judged prematurely. he acknowledged after a long pause. The Confederation has encountered many species throughout the galaxy. Most rely on technological advancement to compensate for biological limitations. Humans appear to have developed another path. Lee remained silent, allowing Varix to continue. This council member requests a demonstration of your philosophical approach, Varix said finally. Not in combat, but as instruction. The council wishes to understand. This request was unprecedented. For the Grand Champion to request teaching from a representative of an unaffiliated world suggested a fundamental shift in the Confederation's perspective. I would be honored, Lee replied. What followed was not what Lee had expected. Rather than a private demonstration, he was led to a large training hall within the command ship. There, hundreds of elite warriors from across the Confederation had gathered. More surprisingly, camera drones hovered throughout the space. Your demonstration will be broadcast throughout the Confederation, explained Varix. All member species should witness this approach to combat. For the next 3 hours, Lee demonstrated the fundamental principles of multiple Earth martial arts traditions, not just Shaolin, but also Aikido, Judo, and Tai Chi. He showed how smaller beings could redirect the force of larger ones, how balance could overcome strength, and how awareness could counter speed. Varix himself participated, allowing Lee to use him to demonstrate key concepts. The sight of the Grand Champion being gently redirected by the much smaller human created a powerful image for the watching audience. Force, Lee explained as he deflected Varix's controlled attack, is neither created nor destroyed, only redirected. The stronger your attack, the more energy I have to work with. Throughout the demonstration, Lee emphasized that these techniques weren't merely physical, they represented a philosophy about power, conflict, and harmony that had developed throughout human history. The impromptu class that followed became the most watched broadcast in Confederation history. Warriors throughout the fleet attempted to mimic the movements they observed. Tactical officers began immediate analysis of how these principles might be incorporated into Confederation combat doctrine. As Lee concluded the demonstration with traditional breathing exercises, Varix approached him privately. Tomorrow, the Grand Champion said, you face me in the final match of the tournament. I will not hold back. Lee bowed. I would expect nothing less. However, Varix continued, regardless of the outcome, the Council has reached a decision regarding Earth's status. Your demonstration today has ensured that humans will be welcomed as full members of the Confederation, not because of technological achievement, but because of philosophical contribution. Lee felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Earth's future was secure. Now he could face the final match with a free mind and open heart. As he returned to the Earth quarters to prepare, Lee reflected on how quickly perceptions had changed. What had begun with mockery of human martial arts had transformed into respect and genuine interest. The final match would no longer determine Earth's fate, but it would determine how humanity would be remembered in this first contact with galactic civilization. The day of the championship match arrived with great anticipation throughout the Confederation fleet. What had begun as a simple tournament to determine Earth's status had transformed into a cultural phenomenon. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds tuned in to watch the final battle between Grand Champion Varix and the unexpected human finalist, Master Lee. The tournament arena had been completely reconfigured for this ultimate contest. Instead of a fixed environment, the championship arena was transformed into variable terrain that could shift at random intervals. One moment desert, the next mountainous, then aquatic. This design was intended to test adaptability alongside combat prowess. Lee arrived 2 hours early, performing his usual meditation rituals in the preparation chamber. Captain Seo and Jin provided last-minute intelligence on Varix's fighting style. He's never lost a match in 17 years, Captain Seo said grimly, and he always saves certain techniques for final matches only. Lee nodded calmly. Every fighter has patterns. Even unpredictability becomes a pattern if observed long enough. As the match time approached, Lee dressed in the simple black clothing he had worn throughout the tournament. His only concession to the changing environments was a breathing apparatus for potential underwater segments. The corridor leading to the arena seemed longer today. Lee walked slowly, conserving energy, his mind clear and focused. He could hear the roar of the spectators, a mix of alien vocalizations that created an otherworldly symphony of excitement. When Lee emerged into the arena, the noise briefly intensified, then fell to expectant silence. The environment was currently set to mimic an earth forest, perhaps a gesture of respect to the human competitor. From the opposite entrance, Verix appeared. The Nexari champion stood 8 feet tall, his black exoskeleton augmented with championship armor that gleamed under the arena lights. Where Lee had chosen simplicity, Verix embodied technological enhancement. His armor incorporated adaptive systems to maximize performance across all potential environments. Verix walked to the center of the arena and bowed in the human style, a gesture that surprised Lee and the watching audience. Lee returned the bow, noting how Verix moved. Despite his size and armor, the champion's movements were fluid and controlled. The tournament official announced the rules. The final match has no time limit. Combat continues until submission, incapacitation, or withdrawal. Environmental shifts will occur randomly. Begin at the signal. A tone sounded, and the match began. Neither competitor moved immediately. They circled each other cautiously, studying movements and potential weaknesses. The audience, expecting an immediate clash, murmured in confusion. "You have impressed many with your techniques," Verix said, his translator conveying the words clearly. "But I have studied all your matches extensively." "As I have studied yours," Lee replied. "Knowledge flows both ways." Verix attacked first, a lightning-fast strike that would have ended the match immediately had it connected. Lee evaded with minimal movement, allowing the blow to pass within millimeters of his body. The precision of his evasion seemed to surprise Verix. Before either could follow up, the environment shifted dramatically. The forest dissolved, replaced by desert terrain. Hot sand replaced firm ground, and both fighters adjusted their stances accordingly. The battle developed a rhythm, brief, intense exchanges followed by tactical retreats and reassessments. Lee focused on conservation of energy, knowing that the champion's enhanced physiology gave him a significant endurance advantage. Each time Verix attacked, Lee redirected the force rather than opposing it, using the alien's power against him. An hour passed. The environment shifted from desert to rocky mountains, then to low-gravity conditions that simulated lunar terrain. Each change required immediate adaptation, testing both fighters' versatility. Lee sustained his first significant injury during the mountain phase, a glancing blow that cracked 2 ribs. The pain was intense, but he compartmentalized it through meditation techniques, preventing it from affecting his performance. "You are injured," Verix observed during a momentary pause. "There is no dishonor in withdrawal." Lee shook his head. The match continues. The environment shifted again, this time to an aquatic setting. Water filled the arena to chest height for Lee, waist height for the taller Verix. Both activated breathing apparatus, but movement became dramatically different. Here, Lee's smaller size became an advantage, allowing faster water navigation. Taking advantage of this, Lee executed a series of strikes targeting the joints of Verix's exoskeleton. The champion countered with powerful sweeps that created waves throughout the arena. One caught Lee off guard, sending him tumbling beneath the surface. For a moment, it seemed the match might end there, but Lee emerged behind Verix, having used the underwater momentum to change position completely. A precise strike to a neural cluster temporarily disabled one of Verix's limbs. The crowd gasped collectively. No one had ever managed to partially disable the champion before. The battle lasted for nearly 3 hours. The environments continued to change. Swampy terrain, zero gravity, extreme heat, darkness where competitors could barely see each other. Through each phase, Lee sustained injuries that would have incapacitated most humans, but his discipline allowed him to continue. His fighting style evolved continuously, adapting not just to environments, but to Varrix's responses to his techniques. In the final hour, Lee appeared to be weakening. His movements slowed, his reactions delayed by microseconds. Varrix pressed his advantage, becoming more aggressive, more confident. This was the pattern observers had seen in all his previous championship matches. The champion would patiently wear down opponents before finishing them decisively. The environment shifted one last time, returning to standard Earth gravity and a simple flat platform. Varrix launched what appeared to be his finishing sequence, a combination of strikes that had defeated countless opponents. But Lee had been waiting for this moment. What had appeared to be weakness was actually careful observation and energy conservation. He had studied recordings of every championship match Varrix had fought, recognizing the pattern that preceded his ultimate attack sequence. As Varrix committed fully to his finishing move, Lee executed a perfect counter, not blocking or absorbing the attack, but redirecting its considerable force in a circular path. He turned Varrix's powerful blow into an opening, using the alien's momentum against him. The champion found himself off balance for the first time in the match. In that split second, Lee executed a perfect sweep that sent Varrix crashing down to the platform with unexpected force. The silence that followed was absolute. Tens of thousands of spectators watched in disbelief as their undefeated champion lay on his back, his systems momentarily overwhelmed by the unexpected reversal. Lee did not press his advantage, but stepped back into a neutral stance, waiting. After a long moment, Varrix rose to a seated position. His armor showed damage from the impact, but his compound eyes focused clearly on Lee. "I concede," Varrix announced, his voice carrying throughout the arena. "This match is concluded." The silence persisted for several heartbeats before the arena erupted in sounds, not just cheers but a complex symphony of alien vocalizations expressing amazement, respect, and excitement. Varrix stood slowly and approached Lee. "The Confederation recognizes that strength comes in many forms," he said, extending a limb in the human gesture of a handshake. Today, wisdom and technique prevailed over raw power. Lee accepted the handshake, wincing slightly from his injuries. "Both have their place," he replied. "Balance is the true goal." The tournament official declared Lee the champion. But what followed was more significant than the title. Varrix invited Lee to address the Confederation directly, an unprecedented honor for a representative of a newly contacted world. Lee's brief speech emphasized cooperation rather than competition, speaking of how different approaches could complement each other rather than compete. He invited Confederation species to learn from humans, even as humans would certainly learn from them. 3 months later, the first Galactic Martial Arts Academy opened its doors in a purpose-built facility orbiting Earth. The building combined Confederation technology with design elements from Earth's traditional dojos and training halls. Large windows offered views of Earth below, a constant reminder of humanity's home and the origins of the techniques taught within. Master Lee, now fully recovered from his injuries, stood before an assembled class unlike any in human history. Students from 17 different species gathered on the training floor, each with unique physiologies and natural abilities. Some towered over their human instructor. Others possessed multiple limbs or sensory capabilities far beyond human range. All shared a common purpose: to learn the fighting philosophy that had allowed a physically inferior human to defeat the Confederation's greatest champions. Ambassador Kim and other Earth officials watched from an observation deck, still amazed at how quickly perceptions had changed. What had begun with mockery of human martial arts had transformed into one of Earth's most valuable contributions to galactic society. Lee surveyed his diverse students, noting their eagerness and curiosity. Some species that had been most dismissive of humans initially had sent the most students. The Drokai, once convinced of their physical superiority, now comprised the largest group in the academy. "Before we begin physical training," Lee announced, his words translated into 17 different languages simultaneously, "we must establish the proper mindset. Many of you come from traditions that emphasize different aspects of combat: speed, strength, natural weapons, technological enhancement. He demonstrated a simple form, the basic movements that underpin more complex techniques. His aging human body moved with grace and precision that belied its limitations. All of these attributes have value, he continued. But true mastery begins elsewhere. We begin, Lee told them, his voice gentle but carrying clearly throughout the hall, by forgetting what we think we know about strength. The students watched intently as Lee continued his demonstration. As he moved through increasingly complex forms, representatives of the most powerful species in the galaxy sought to emulate the movements of a human who had changed their understanding of combat forever. Outside the academy, Earth ships and Confederation vessels moved in coordinated patterns, the beginning of joint exercises that would eventually lead to integrated defense forces. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not through technological superiority or physical prowess, but through the wisdom accumulated across thousands of years of adapting to limitations. And in that first class of the Galactic Martial Arts Academy, a new chapter began, not just for humanity, but for a confederation that had discovered there was still much to learn from a species they had initially dismissed as weak.